The silver spoon hitting the porcelain sounded like a gunshot in the silent dining room. My mother-in-law, Evelyn, didn't just speak, she performed. She sat at the head of the mahogany table, her spine as rigid as the high-backed chair, looking at me with a mixture of pity and sharpened malice that she usually reserved for the hired help. Around us, the air felt thick, charged with the kind of tension that makes your skin itch. The heavy scent of roasted lamb and expensive red wine suddenly felt suffocating. "Melissa," she said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly calm register, "I think we've reached the limit of my patience. We've been more than generous, but even family needs to pull their weight. It's time we discuss the rent. You've been in the guest house for 6 months now, and I haven't seen a single cent. My name is Melissa Grant. I'm 38 years old." I felt the heat rush to my cheeks instantly, a searing, prickly sensation that started at my neck and climbed to my temples. I looked down at my plate, my fork trembling slightly in my hand. Beside me, my 15-year-old daughter Chloe froze. She stopped chewing, her eyes fixed on her water glass, her shoulders hunching inward as if she were trying to disappear into the upholstery. Across the table sat Evelyn's sister-in-law, Margaret, and the family's longtime accountant, Marcus. Even the neighbors, the Millers, were there, having been invited for what I thought was a casual Sunday dinner. Now, they were the audience to my public stripping. Marcus cleared his throat and looked at the ceiling. Margaret took a very long, very slow sip of her wine, her eyes darting toward me with a glint of whispered judgment. The Millers looked at each other, then back at their plates, the silence stretching out until it felt like a physical weight on my chest. "Evelyn, please?" I whispered, my voice cracking. "Can we talk about this later? Not in front of everyone." "Why?" Evelyn asked, leaning forward. She reached into her silk handbag and pulled out a stack of printed bank statements, fanning them out on the white tablecloth like a winning hand of poker. "If you're responsible enough to live on this estate, you should be responsible enough to handle a public accounting. These records show nothing from you. You're a medical billing specialist, aren't you? Surely you understand how numbers work. Or are you just as disorganized with your finances as you were with your marriage?" I looked at my husband, David. He was sitting directly opposite me. He was staring at his wine glass, rotating it slowly by the stem. He didn't look up. He didn't say a word. He didn't even reach out to touch my hand. His silence felt like a physical blow, a confirmation that in this house, I was an island. "I'm stabilizing, Evelyn," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You know the divorce took everything. I'm working freelance. I'm getting back on my feet." "You're loitering," she snapped. The neighbors flinched. "And you're teaching my granddaughter that life is a free ride. Chloe, honey, you need to understand that your mother is living off charity. If she won't pay, maybe we should start charging you for your school tuition. Would you like that? To earn your stay?" Chloe's eyes welled up with tears. She pushed her chair back, the screech of wood on hardwood floor making everyone wince, and bolted from the room. I started to stand up, but Evelyn's voice pinned me to my seat. "Sit down, Melissa. We aren't finished. I have the legal eviction papers for the guest house being drafted as we speak. If I don't see a formal rental agreement signed by Friday, including the backdated payments, you can find a motel. I won't have a squatter under my roof." The Millers were whispering now, their heads bent together. I could hear the word unfortunate and entitled. I felt like I was drowning in a room full of people who were watching the bubbles rise to the surface. I realized then, with a cold, terrifying clarity, that this wasn't an outburst. It was a siege. This moment had been planned, polished, and executed for maximum damage. I looked at the bank statements she had thrown down. I saw the dates. I saw the highlighted sections. And in that moment of absolute humiliation, something inside me didn't break. It went quiet. It was the same quiet I used when I had to audit a messy hospital ledger. I wasn't rich, and I wasn't powerful like the Grants, but I was meticulous. They hadn't noticed that about me yet. The days following the dinner were a blur of social suffocation. The estate, which usually felt sprawling and open, suddenly felt like a cage with invisible bars. Whenever I walked into the main house to get mail or use the laundry, the air would change. The housekeepers, who used to chat with me about Chloe's school, suddenly found urgent tasks in other rooms. I was removed from the family group chat on Tuesday. No explanation, just a notification that Evelyn Grant has removed you from the conversation. I found out through a stray comment from a cousin that they were planning a beach trip for the upcoming long weekend. I hadn't been asked. Chloe came home from a local birthday party crying because she'd overheard Margaret telling another mother that I was bleeding Evelyn dry and refused to contribute a single dollar to the household. The isolation was surgical. It was meant to make me feel small, to make me feel like I didn't exist unless Evelyn acknowledged me. "Maybe you should just sign the papers, Mel," David said one night as I sat at my small desk in the guest house. He was leaning against the doorframe looking tired. "She's just stressed." You know how she is. She likes things in order. If you just apologize and sign the agreement for the $9,000, she'll let it go. I'll help you pay it off eventually. $9,000, David? I looked at him, my eyes burning. That's backdated rent for time she told us was a gift. She invited us here. She told me to take my time to recover. She's changing her mind. Just don't make a scene. You're overreacting to the dinner. It was a joke that went a bit far. You're being too sensitive. I stared at him. A joke? She threatened to evict us in front of the neighbors? She was frustrated, he said, shrugging. Maybe you are the problem here. Maybe you just don't know how to show gratitude. Honestly, I'm starting to see her point. He walked out, leaving me in the dark. I felt a wave of genuine panic. If David was turning, I had no one. I sat there, staring at the shadows on the wall, thinking that maybe they were right. Maybe I was a failure. Maybe I did deserve to be treated like a charity case because I couldn't provide a mansion for my daughter. I picked up a pen, ready to sign the document Evelyn had left on my doorstep, a formal demand for $9,600. My hand hovered over the signature line. My heart was thumping against my ribs. But then, my eyes caught a line on the second page of the expense report Marcus, the accountant, had prepared. It was a charge for guest house HVAC maintenance, $1,200. I frowned. I remembered that day. The repairman had been there for 20 minutes, and he'd told me it was just a tripped breaker. He hadn't even charged a service fee because he was already on the property for the main house. I didn't sign. I put the pen down. My breathing slowed. I didn't go to sleep. Instead, I turned on my laptop and began to pull every single digital bank record I had from the last year. I started a spreadsheet. I am a medical billing specialist. I find the money that people try to hide in the fine print. I spent the next 3 nights in a fever of documentation. I didn't argue with Evelyn when she saw me in the driveway and made a comment about my laziness. I didn't reply to the snarky emails from Margaret. I just worked. I photographed the mail that was being withheld. I took screenshots of the bank transfers. I had actually made small amounts, sure, but contributions for groceries and utilities that Evelyn had conveniently omitted from her public accounting. The printer in the guest house hummed late into the night. The smell of warm ink and the crisp, cold edges of the paper became my only comforts. I was no longer a victim. I was an auditor. I reached out to Rachel Kim, an old client of mine who worked as a compliance officer for a major hospital group. We met at a nondescript coffee shop 3 towns over. I didn't want anyone to see us. "Look at these, Rachel," I said, sliding the ledgers across the table. "Evelyn claims she's paying for everything out of the family trust account. But look at these recurring monthly transfers. $4,000 every month, labeled as consulting fees to a private LLC. Rachel donned her reading glasses, her face turning serious. She spent 20 minutes scrolling through the digital files I'd shared. "Melissa, do you know who owns this LLC?" "No," I said. "I couldn't find the registration." Rachel tapped a few keys on her own laptop. "I can. Give me an hour." When she called me later that afternoon, her voice was tight. "The LLC is registered to a residential address in the city. The occupant is Thomas Vance. Melissa, isn't that the Grant's private driver?" I felt a chill run down my spine. "Thomas? He's been with them for 10 years. Evelyn treats him like a son." "She's treating him like something else," Rachel said. "The money isn't coming from her personal account. It's being skimmed from the estate's maintenance fund, the same fund she's accusing you of depleting. She's using the rent she's demanding from you to cover the hole she's making to pay her lover." The realization hit me like a physical weight. She wasn't just cruel, She was a thief, and she was using me as the scapegoat to balance the books before the annual trust audit. The following Sunday, Evelyn called a family council in the grand living room. She wanted the matter settled. She had invited Marcus, the accountant, and even David's sister to witness the finalization of the debt agreement. The room was beautiful, floor-to-ceiling windows, white roses in crystal vases, but it felt like an execution chamber. Evelyn sat on the silk sofa, the legal documents laid out on the coffee table. "Melissa, I hope you've come to your senses. We've had the Millers asking questions, and I'd like to tell them this has been resolved. Sign the papers, acknowledge the debt, and we can move forward. Otherwise, the moving trucks will be here Tuesday." David stood by the fireplace, looking at the floor. The rest of the family sat in a semicircle, their faces a mask of bored indifference and slight annoyance that their Sunday was being interrupted by my drama. I walked to the center of the room. I wasn't carrying the signed agreement. I was carrying a heavy professional-grade expansion folder. "I'm not signing that, Evelyn," I said. My voice was calm. It wasn't the voice of the woman who had cried at the dinner table. It was the voice I used when I was correcting a surgeon on a billing code. Evelyn laughed, a sharp, dry sound. "Then pack your bags. Marcus, show her the consequences." "Actually," I said, stepping toward the coffee table, "I'd like Marcus to look at something else first. Since we're being so public about finances, let's be thorough." I opened the folder and began laying out the documents. I didn't throw them. I placed them precisely side by side. "This is the HVAC invoice you claimed cost $1,200. Here is the technician's signed statement that the work was free. This is the record of the $500 I transferred to you for groceries last month, which you claimed never happened. And these..." I paused, feeling the room go deathly still. "These are the records of the monthly $4,000 transfers to Vance Consulting." Evelyn's face didn't just pale, it turned a sickly shade of gray. Her hand, which had been reaching for her tea, stopped midair. "I have my friend Rachel Kim, a senior compliance officer, on speakerphone right now," I said, placing my phone on the table. Rachel's voice filled the room. "Hello, everyone. I've flagged these transactions as potential embezzlement from the Grant Family Trust. Since the funds are being diverted from a shared trust into a private LLC owned by a domestic employee, this is a matter for the trustees and, potentially, the authorities." The shift in the room was instantaneous. Marcus, the accountant, leaned forward, his professional curiosity overriding his loyalty to Evelyn. He snatched up the papers I'd laid out. David finally looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. Margaret, who had been smugly watching the proceedings, suddenly looked like she wanted to bolt for the door. "What is this?" David asked, his voice cracking. "Mother, who is Thomas Vance?" Evelyn tried to rally. She stood up, her chest heaving. "This is a lie. She's forged these. She's trying to deflect because she's a penniless loser." "The bank records don't lie, Evelyn," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "I have the IP addresses for the transfers. They originated from your private office. I also have the photographs of you and Thomas at the Fairmont Hotel last month. I was looking for proof of my residency for the rental agreement, and I found the receipts in your desk. You really shouldn't leave your consulting files in the same drawer as the property taxes." The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the power drain out of her. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a slow-motion shattering. She looked at Marcus, but he wouldn't look back. He was too busy looking at the evidence that could cost him his license if he ignored it. She looked at David, but for the first time in his life, he didn't look like a son seeking approval. He looked like a man who had been cheated. "I don't owe you $9,600, I said, my words cutting through the air like a knife. "In fact, based on the misallocated funds from the trust that were meant for guest house upkeep money you pocketed or gave to Thomas, the trust actually owes me for the repairs and utilities I've been paying out of pocket." I turned to Marcus. "I want a written retraction of the debt claim. I want a formal apology for the public defamation at dinner last week. And I want a legal separation of my and Chloe's living arrangements from Evelyn's oversight, effective immediately, funded by the trust as per the original inheritance agreement David's father set up." Marcus nodded slowly. I think that is a very wise path to take, Melissa. Given the irregularities, Evelyn sank back onto the sofa. She looked old. The mask of the wealthy, untouchable matriarch had slipped, and underneath was just a scared, dishonest woman who had lost her grip on the only thing she cared about, her reputation. The aftermath was quiet. There were no more screaming matches. There was just the sound of pens on paper as the legal corrections were made. I didn't stay to watch her cry. I didn't need her tears. I needed my dignity. 2 weeks later, I sat in the kitchen of our new apartment. It wasn't a guest house on an estate, but it was ours. The air didn't feel heavy here. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, and I could hear Chloe in the next room, laughing as she talked to a friend on the phone. There was no tension in her voice, no fear. I had received a formal letter from the family's legal counsel, clearing my name of any financial wrongdoing and acknowledging the accounting errors made by Evelyn. David had moved out of the main house, finally forced to see the reality of the woman he had spent his life defending. He was trying to apologize, but I wasn't ready to listen yet. I was enjoying the silence. I realized then that people like Evelyn rely on your shame. They bank on the fact that you'll be too embarrassed by their lies to actually look at the truth. But when you stop being afraid of the humiliation, they lose their only weapon. I'm Melissa Grant, and I'm no longer the woman who stays silent at the dinner table. If you've ever felt like you were being drowned out by people with more power or more money than you, remember that the truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It just needs to be documented. Quiet people aren't weak. We're just waiting for the right moment to present the facts. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up to a family member who tried to rewrite your reality? How did you find your voice? Let's support each other in reclaiming our respect. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing for more stories about finding strength in the middle of the storm. Click the Write Your Own Story link to share your experience and help others who might be trapped in silence. Thank you for listening and for creating a space where the truth matters more than the volume. Stay calm, stay observant, and never let someone else tell you what you're worth. I'll see you in the next story.